we study in school, a place of fairness, a place of law, where the will of the people prevails over individual ambition. We learn at a young age about the sanctity of the vote. Indeed, our entire system is based on the principle of a vote cast is a vote counted. What you're about to see is a story that shatters that principle of fairness. It's a story of power and the abuse of power. This is not fiction. It really happened. It is the story of how the party that has ruled the House of Representatives for 30 years, the Democrat Party, stole an election. Here's what happened. On November 6, 1984, Richard McIntyre won a very close election for Congress over Frank McCluskey in the 8th Congressional District of Indiana. The margin of victory was 34 votes. Because of the closeness of the vote, both sides petitioned for a recount under Indiana law. McIntyre won a second time, this time by a margin of over 400 votes. Rick McIntyre arrived at the House of Representatives on January 3, 1985, with a valid certificate of election issued by the Indiana Secretary of State. Never before in our history has a congressman-elect been denied a seat if he has had an undisputed certificate of election. Even in cases where the House has investigated the election, the person with the certificate is seated until the investigation has been completed. In an unprecedented action, the House voided the certificate of election and decided to seat neither candidate.
According to the President, the Chair will swear in all members of the House at this time. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, upon my responsibility as a member-elect of the 99th Congress, I object to the oath being administered to the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. McIntyre. I base this upon facts and statements which I consider to be reliable.
This left the voters of the 8th District of Indiana without a voice in the House. This was the first step the Democrats took in what was to become the outright theft of a congressional seat. The Democrats decided to appoint a task force made up of 2 Democrats and 1 Republican to conduct a third count of the ballots. On party line votes, the task force threw out all Indiana election law and adopted new counting rules. These rules were artificial. They didn't exist anywhere in the real world of election law. And no one has ever been elected to Congress in any state under these rules. These rules were purely and simply designed to let Frank McCluskey win the congressional recount. As the recount progressed, certain ballots could not be decided by the recount supervisors. These ballots were set aside for the later ruling by the task force. It is out of these ballots that were set aside that the theft occurred. At the heart of the controversy are a total of 42 unnotarized absentee ballots. Under Indiana law, these ballots should not be opened and counted, and they weren't. On Election Day, 10 of these ballots were sent to the precincts by mistake. The error was caught, and they were returned unopened to the courthouse. In their second hearing, when McCluskey was behind by 12 votes in the running totals, the task force voted to open and count these 10 ballots. In the final hearing the following week, after McCluskey had moved into a 4-vote lead, the task force reversed itself and voted not to count the other 32 identical ballots. The Democrats on the task force argued that because the 10 ballots had made a 1-day trip to the precincts and back, they were somehow different from the other 32.
Some of those unnotarized and unwitnessed ballots that were sent to the precincts were not opened. They were not counted election night. They were not counted recount. But this task force opened those ballots and counted them. Now we have unnotarized, unwitnessed ballots, identical to those that are in the precinct, except the clerk followed Indiana law and didn't send them out, yet they have signed an affidavit saying that they have been pure and pristine in the way in which they have been handled. They are not contaminated. They are here available for you. The only difference is one was sent to the precinct and one was not. What I am telling you, Mr. Chairman, is that under your rules, which you shoved down my throat, and which is in front of you, and you are eating off of that plate that's in front of you, you're starting to choke on those very same rules. Only given the votes that you have, you're going to be able to change the menu. You ordered what was on that plate, and now you're choking on it when you're trying to eat it. All I'm asking you to do is clean your plate. You set it up, you clean it up. And that's what I'm talking about in terms of being consistent.
In the final hearing the following week, after McCluskey had moved into a 4-vote lead, the task force decided on a 2-to-1 party line vote not to count the other 32 identical ballots. On April 22nd, the task force met in Washington. Once again, the Republican member of the task force, Congressman Bill Thomas, objected to the 2-to-1 vote not to count the 32 disputed ballots. The next day, the Committee on House Administration met to review the report of its task force.
Right up until the very end, despite the rigged rules, Bill Thomas's side had a chance to win. We were within a vote or two of each other. We get down to the end, and we've got some military votes, and we've got some non-notarized votes, which are identical to 62 votes that we've counted before. And what happens? The task force says, hey, our guy's ahead. We can quit. And the press in Indiana sat there open mouth gaping and say, they can't do this. They can't do that to the people of Indiana, but they did. They stopped the election, and the task force, therefore, in my judgment, is guilty of being not only a derelict in following the Constitution and the precepts of representative government, it couldn't even follow its own rules. It quit as soon as its guy got ahead.
And ladies and gentlemen, I would like to just for a minute introduce to you Mark Barkley. Is Mark here? This is one of the individuals, a real person, a registered voter in the 8th District of Indiana who's been disenfranchised by the arbitrary decision not to count some ballots. Not because they were held securely equally, but because the chairman perpetuates the attempt to make a distinction without a difference. That one ballot went to the precincts and came back, and the other ballot had been retained by the county clerk with equal security for the entire time.
At that meeting, James Shumway, an Arizona election official selected by the Democrats to supervise the recount, agreed under questioning that fundamental fairness required counting the 32 ballots.
Mr. Shumway, if you agreed to count the first ballots, what would you have done in your professional position with the second set of ballots? Would you have counted them or not counted them?
Based on the security and the handling, I guess we would have counted.
I thank the gentleman. So fairness, if you want to define fairness under the rules, is counting like ballots similarly. And on the basis of security, except for the distinction without a difference of some of those ballots making a one-day trip to the precinct and back, they were identical, and if they had been afforded the same security, and if they survived the procedural check, you would have counted them. Mr. Chairman, the task force on a 2-to-1 vote decided not to count like ballots.
In an attempt at compromise, Congressman Thomas offered a resolution that, due to the controversy surrounding the election and the recount, called for a new special election. This was voted down on a straight party line vote.
In this vote, the nays ayes are 7, and the nays are 12. The motion does not carry.
At this point, the entire 8th District controversy was gaining national attention. Prominent newspapers from around the country called for a special election. The New York Times. The problem is that the recounts have been hopelessly tainted by the appearance of partisanship. Wisdom and fairness argue for a special election. The Philadelphia Inquirer. Yet after so many contested recounts and partisan power plays, the only way to purge the taint of suspicion that either party stole the seat is to hold a new election, and the sooner the better. The Washington Post. In an election so close, neither contestant should be seated. The House, embroiled in an ear-splitting dispute over the outcome, should in fact declare the seat vacant and let Indiana hold another election.
My understanding of the tape was that
Republican members of the House met to plan their strategy. They agreed to slow down business in the House and later staged a demonstration on the House steps. The Democrats agreed to let the full House vote on April 30th on whether or not to have a special election before the vote scheduled for May 1st to seat Frank McCluskey. In one last appeal to fairness, the National Republican Congressional Committee placed a full-page ad in the 2 Washington newspapers the day of the vote, urging a new election. The debate was bitter and occasionally eloquent.
But I can tell you this wound will not heal without a terrible price and a scar that will be with this House for many years. It would appear, Mr. Speaker, that we have 2 kinds of folks in the majority. Those who listen and work with the Republican minority and those who do not believe we are full-fledged partners in this House. In baseball terms, those are the kind of folks who call for their pitcher to stick it in the batter's ear. And the unmitigated gall The unmitigated temerity comes when once you make us hit the dirt, then you become unpleasant and point the finger at us when we get back up and ready to swing. Yesterday, I stood to underscore my belief that Leon Panetta is an honorable man, only to be lectured by the majority leader that somehow my additional expression of frustration and anger and outrage was beneath the dignity of this body. I say this to the majority leader: you people dish it out every day, but you sure can't take it. I know the majority leader and the speaker and those that make up the cabal that is responsible for this whole business will respond that we shouldn't feel that way. I know that. They have argued their version of the facts, but regardless of that attitude, we feel this case was handled unfairly for the reasons so eloquently stated in the House debate. And it is that sense of unfairness that will live long after this dispute is over. Yes, Mr. Speaker. Yes, Mr. Speaker. I will take off my button. I will take off my button. My thou shalt not steal button. A slogan too harsh? I think not. I will go back to work with you, sir. But for me and my colleagues, this House is not the same. The collective sense of unfairness symbolized by this button remains in our hearts. And the sad, sad thing is, we didn't have to go down this road.
There are 32 Americans who, and I quote directly the chairman of the task force, should not have valid ballots disenfranchised, and if the error is not in the voter, should be counted. We ask that they be counted. We do not know for whom they would vote. These are secured ballots. They might make the Democrat win by 32 more votes. That's okay. Half of them might be for the Republican. We don't know. But when a House makes a committee 2-1 and then stops counting, we believe America has been disenfranchised.
The call for a special election was voted on, but even with 19 Democrats switching sides to join with the United Republican Party, there were not enough votes to carry the motion. The next day, the vote was held to seat Frank McCloskey. Although the Republicans took part in the debate and the vote, they walked out in protest when McCloskey was sworn in.
This is a sad day in the history of the U.S. House of Representatives. I think many of us here feel like weeping for our country because the Constitution has been trampled, 2 centuries of precedents have been thrown out the window, and Indiana law has been trashed, as have its elected officials. And we do believe that Rick McIntyre remains the duly elected and certified member from the state of Indiana. And we're very, very sad that in America, in the U.S. House of Representatives, the sacred right of people to vote and have their votes counted honestly and fairly has been lost in the action that was taken. It's interesting that this began on January 3rd with the Democrats screaming, "Count all the votes." And it ended with all but 2 of them voting against Bill Frenzel's motion to, in fact, count all the votes.
There's not much else to say that hasn't already been said here. A lot of things have been covered over the last several weeks and months. But once again, I would just like to express my thanks to everybody, the conference members especially, because this has united the Republican Party like nothing else. And this is an issue that's going to live on after Rick McIntyre goes home to his family this evening. And this is something that the American people are not going to forget about.
After months, weeks, and days of trying to preserve the integrity of our system, the Republicans had run out of time. Frank McCloskey was seated as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, and the whole country was watching.
The walkout was unprecedented. Almost all 182 Republicans marched off the House floor and outside.
You are a member of the Congress of the United States.
They walked out just before Democrat Frank McCloskey was sworn in after a bitter partisan battle over the closest congressional contest this century.
I won. I can look anybody in the eye and show them I won.
House Republicans accused the Democrats of stealing the election and worse.
Manipulation, rape, theft, old-time big city graveyard voting politics at its best.
Many major newspapers agree with Republicans that such a close, disputed election should be rerun. And several Democrats believe their party is wrong.
I think there's a cloud over it. I think that the election appears to be tainted, and I think the only way to dispel that cloud is to have a new election.
But other Democrats prevailed in the debate.
There's no rule here that says when you win by 4, you have a playoff.
Republicans are so angry they threaten to disrupt House business, but they know if they do that, the president's programs will be delayed. Bob Kerr, NBC News at the U.S. Capitol.
And what about the mystery of the 32 unopened ballots? The names of the 32 voters were on the outside of the unopened ballots as required by law. The Evansville Courier contacted 26 of the 32 voters a few days after Frank McCloskey was seated. We know that Rick McIntyre won on election night 1984. We also know Rick McIntyre won the state-conducted recount. And now, according to the Courier, 20 of the 26 voters whose ballots were not counted by the Democrat task force went for McIntyre. And so, Rick McIntyre won a third time, and Frank McCloskey is the congressman from the 8th District of Indiana. For Rick McIntyre, the long days and nights of struggle and uncertainty were over for now. For the rest of us, we need to be on guard. If we're not, what might have been an exception to the rule of tradition and law could become a common occurrence.